Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Garryowen Irish Pub. Welcome to another installment of the Tattooed Historian Presents. My name is John Heckman. I am the Tattooed Historian. Thank you all for coming out and surviving the rainstorm that we had on your way in. I'm lucky enough the equipment didn't get wet on top of everything else. But tonight we're going to be talking about the Battle of Antietam, which is a very hot topic with a bunch of Civil War people and Civil War nerds like me. And I'm glad to have with us this evening Mr. Dan Vermilya, a good friend of mine, and I'm also glad to have his book here because I got a nice copy of this, so thank you for that. That Field of Blood, the Battle of Antietam, September 17th, 1862, which Dan wrote for the Emerging Civil War series, and we're going to be talking about that tonight. And I also want to give a shout-out to the sponsors of the event, which is the Gettysburg Foundation and Gettysburg National Military Park. So thanks, guys, for helping out with that. I know some of them are watching here on the live stream. And Dan, thanks for coming out and being a part of this.
Thanks for having me, John. It's great to be here. I will say that this is probably the most positive crowd Vermilya's ever drawn in a pub before, so that's good.
That's one way to put it.
Yeah. So, no, it's I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm a big fan of what you do, John, a big fan of how you're bringing history to folks, and this is really awesome. I'm glad to be here tonight. So,
well, thank you, and I didn't even pay him to say that, which is awesome. Yeah. But I asked you about what you would like to talk about because you have a plethora of knowledge about a lot of things.
I do. Some of them are useful. So of the different things I thought we might talk about tonight, I thought we'd talk about something that's pretty near and dear to my heart, a subject in history that I'm quite passionate about. I've worked for the National Park Service for about a decade now, and I started working for the Park Service at Antietam Battlefield in Maryland back in 2010. And Antietam has long been a very important part of my own personal story, a part of my interest in history. When I was a kid, I became fascinated in history mostly because of Antietam. It's something that we'll talk about at some point tonight, so we might as well mention it right up front. My ancestor, my great-great-great-grandfather, was killed at the battle. And learning about that as a kid, hearing my grandfather and my dad tell me stories about him, he was a private in the 106th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. It kind of, it made the battle real for me in a way. It helped to give a face and a name to one of the soldiers who was there. So I was always fascinated by it. My grandfather gave me this old leather-bound green book that was all dusty and beaten up, and it was the history of the 106th Pennsylvania that was printed in the 1880s, and it had a little red X in the roster next to my ancestor's name. So I remember going through that as a kid and just being fascinated by the story. So for about a decade now, I've really studied Antietam professionally, having worked there for the Park Service, and it's really an incredible battle to talk about. Obviously, we're here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and most of what we talk about here in Gettysburg is 1863, but sometimes we forget that the war did exist outside of 3 days in July 1863. I would argue, as would others, that the most important day of the war was September 17th, 1862, and I would argue that for several different reasons. Antietam is perhaps most famous as, of course, the bloodiest single day of the war, with over 23,000 casualties in 12 hours. I would argue, though, that while that's its most famous aspect, its greatest significance is that it was the battle that significantly impacted the Emancipation Proclamation, and that it's kind of rare in history that you have a singular one-day event like that that so clearly and directly links to the freedom of millions of people. It really was a watershed moment in the Civil War. It changed things entirely. It's the first battlefield that's photographed before the dead were buried. It's the first time that American people are seeing pictures of dead soldiers outside of the battlefield itself. It really was a game-changing moment in American history in many different ways. And actually, I thought I'd share a Bruce Catton quote here to help kind of set the tone for what we'll talk about tonight. He wrote this in 1958. What America is and hopes to be dates from the fight along Antietam Creek. The fight cost an enormous number of lives and inflicted pain and disability on many thousands more, but in the infinite economy of the advance of the human race, it may have been worth what it cost. So first of all, no one can really put words together like Bruce Catton. But just the idea that, yes, this was a absolutely horrific day. It was a horrific event, but in the end, perhaps it may have been worth the cost in terms of what it did for freedom. So it's really a fascinating topic. Not everything we'll talk about will be quite that deep this evening, perhaps. But it's a fascinating topic, so I'm excited to talk about it a little bit, especially because it's a battle that there's a lot that's been written about it, but still there are some pretty significant prevailing myths about the battle, some pretty significant prevailing interpretations that might not really be all that accurate. And over the last 10, 20 years or so, there's been a lot of new scholarship about Antietam that's kind of helped to change our opinions of certain figures in the battle and the campaign, certain aspects of it. So in the spirit of kind of changing things up and shaking things up a little bit, I thought we'd talk about that stuff a little bit tonight too. So.
Well, that's what I'm all about, changing it up and shaking it up a little bit. Before we go on, I want to check, how many here know that they have ancestors who were at Antietam? Anybody? Anybody have ancestors? I know I have. Definitely you do. And that's what gets us involved, like you say, that personal connection to the past, and I think it's very important. When you talk about, was the battle a stalemate, a draw, as we would say, was it a federal victory?
Yeah.
Where do your interpretations of that come from?
Well, for a very long time, Antietam has been judged this stalemate, that essentially both armies duked it out throughout the day on September 17th, and then at the conclusion of the day, nothing had really been determined. It's a stalemate. It's not a victory. It's nothing for the Union Army. I and many others, and I'm going to steal an argument from my good friend John Hoptack here, because I do that a lot, but I and many others advocate that it's a strong Union victory for many different reasons. At the start of the campaign, in early September of 1862, Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, they are on an absolute winning streak. In 2 months' time, they have taken the war from the seat of Richmond and the Peninsula Campaign, moving it all the way to the doorstep of Washington, D.C. So they have the momentum on their side. Lee is coming north into Maryland, hoping to accomplish a set of goals. Namely, he's really trying to just get a victory over Union forces on Union soil. Even though Maryland is a slave-owning border state, it's still northern soil. So Lee crosses the Potomac with this goal in mind, trying to have a victory over Union forces. And at the end of the day, in the Maryland campaign, Lee does not achieve that goal. On the other side, you have George Mcclellan, commander of the Union Army of the Potomac, who we'll talk more about here as we get going. Everybody's favorite Civil War general, right? George McClellan. Boo, okay.
Wow.
All right, tough crowd.
Yeah, it is tough.
So George McClellan, commander of the Union Army of the Potomac at the start of the campaign, has this cobbled together force that we'll talk about more here as we go. It's an army that he builds brand new in the span of just a few days in September of 1862. It's really a unique thing in the history of the Civil War that you have an army built that quickly and really not even that well. And they're moved right out into the field and engaged in major combat right away. And McClellan had the goals of essentially preventing Lee from accomplishing what he was going to accomplish and keep him away from the capital. So if we're going to simply tally up the scoreboard, Lee and the Confederates do not achieve their goals. McClellan does achieve his strategic goals for the campaign. But on a more basic note, and this is where I'm stealing an argument from my good buddy John Hoptack, who wrote the foreword for my book, and he makes this argument in the foreword. Essentially, I will describe a campaign for you, and you tell me if it's Antietam or Gettysburg. Confederate Army is coming off of a major victory. They move north into Union territory, looking for a victory over Union forces on Union soil that could potentially win the war. Union forces, in the midst of commander disarray and turnover, catch up with them. A major, horrific battle is fought. At the conclusion of that battle, both armies are still on the field, and then the next day, one of the armies starts to retreat. Which battle did I just describe? Both. However, one of those battles is described as an outright Union victory. I don't think I've ever met anyone who's ever said that Gettysburg was not a Union victory. And the other battle is always described as a stalemate.
Right. Do you think that's historical memory?
I do.
Yeah?
I do. And I think that If it was a different commander other than McClellan at Antietam, perhaps, we might view it differently. The Confederates were always better at spinning history during the war. Obviously, we know about the lost cause after the war, but the lost cause actually starts during the war itself. You have Confederates who, after Antietam, are already painting the picture. Lafayette McLaws writes a letter home in early October saying, essentially, you know, we were outnumbered 3-4 to 1, and we did pretty well. So, yeah, I think a lot of it is historical memory and how things evolve. And even some will say that, well, you know, Lee held his own. He was outnumbered. Yes, he was outnumbered to an extent, and he wasn't wiped off the field, but still, overall, I think you'd have to say it's a Union victory.
Right. Yeah.
Issue that McClellan didn't go after them?
Well, that is an issue that historians have attributed to McClellan. So essentially, and this is good. You know, we can jump around and get into stuff because ultimately that's what I'd like to do.
Right.
So when you say go after Lee, there's a couple different scenarios in which he could have done that at the battle. There's essentially on September 18th. Why didn't the battle continue that day? That's something that a lot of historians say that perhaps limits it from being an outright victory. Well, on the morning of the 18th, McClellan's initial intention was to continue the battle that morning. He had received some reinforcements during the evening. One of those reinforcing divisions was about 6,000 men, and they had undertaken a 24-mile night march over 2 mountains to get there. So some of these reinforcements coming in for McClellan aren't really what we would describe as battle-ready guys. So I think McClellan's looking around and thinking, maybe I'm going to give it a day and then resume the battle on the 19th. Once Lee retreats, there actually is a battle on the banks of the Potomac River, the Battle of Shepherdstown on the 19th and 20th. And it's not really well known. There's not a lot written about it. There's no National Park Service site there. So it doesn't really get the attention that the bigger battles get. But there actually is a pursuit action on the banks of the Potomac. And the Confederates are able to fend off the Union pursuit and get away back into Virginia. So Shepherdstown's a pretty interesting fight. And then after that, it's a question for McClellan of he wants to still try to reboot this army that he built very quickly. So there is something of a pursuit. But I would also say with the Gettysburg comparison, again, you know, that's the same thing we hear about Meade and Gettysburg, and yet it doesn't temper the fact that we describe the battle as a Union victory. So I would say, you know, to your point, I think a lot of it is historical memory.
Yeah, I was going to say that question has been asked of me and others for years about Gettysburg. Was Meade slow to go after Lee? And and it's the same. It goes back to John's point.
Yeah,
you know, it really works in well. And I never considered those options when you line them all up like that.
Yeah, if you just compare the two, just take the commanders, take the personalities out of it, they're very similar.
Right. So would you say that McClellan gets a bum rap?
I do. I definitely do. I think George McClellan was put in a very difficult spot in early September of 1862. He certainly was not a perfect general. He's not a guy I would sit down and have a beer with. Personality-wise, he leaves a lot to be desired, I think. The way he acted towards Lincoln at various times in the war was not ideal, especially with the Harrison Landing letter, things like that, from the summer of '62. And certainly McClellan's biggest flaw is that he's wholeheartedly against the Emancipation Proclamation. He shares a fundamentally different view of the war than Abraham Lincoln does, which is ultimately why he was relieved of command, one of the reasons. But I think McClellan's just a fascinating figure. He really can't win in Civil War history because his two biggest antagonists in the war are the two most beloved figures of the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln and Robert E. Lee. Politically, he runs against Lincoln in 1864, and on the battlefield, he's facing off against Lee. So no matter which side of the Mason-Dixon line you're on, you have cause to dislike him because he is an antagonist for the most beloved figure in the North and the most beloved figure in the South.
With Antietam, you have so many new recruits. I know when my ancestor got to Antietam, he'd been in the Army for a month.
Yeah.
And he probably didn't even fire his weapon more than 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
How does that influence our thought process on the battle and when we go down there and we see a place like that?
1 out of every 4 Union soldiers at Antietam were brand new, had never been in combat before. And comparatively for the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, it's almost statistically irrelevant the number of soldiers who had never been in combat before. About 60% of the Confederate Army had been in 3 or more major battles or campaigns, and it's about 10% of the Union Army that you can say the same thing for. So experience-wise, there's really no contest between the 2 armies there. And you said with your ancestor only firing his gun a few times. Right. That was actually a common refrain. Some of the, Ezra Carman, I believe it was, in the 13th New Jersey, said he encountered other officers in their regiments who said that their guys didn't know how to form a line of battle and things like that. And a lot of these guys were raised in the summer of '62 to answer the call for a couple 100,000 new recruits, and they had just gotten to Washington at the end of August, early September. And guess what? If you're a new recruit, that's not a good place to be in 1862 at that time. So.
Yeah,
it's a quick turnaround for a lot of these guys. They are learning as they go.
Right. Yeah, and they are as green as you can get, as we say.
Yeah.
And just speaking on personal reference here, that the first place that my ancestor went to battle is the Sunken Road at Antietam, striking that.
Yeah.
And it's just, you have to think about, these are new people going into battle, new recruits, and they're hitting entrenched positions. They're hitting people in cornfields. They're going up against a bridge, South Bridge. There has to be so much logistical nightmares going on the field because some of these guys don't even know their left from their right, and they're going out there and trying to figure this out. It's almost like Bull Run all over again. Yeah,
for some of the Union units there, it really is. And I should pause here to say that none of this is to suggest that the Confederate Army did not have problems. They have problems with equipment, they have problems with nutrition, they have problems with being the numerically smaller force. Like, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia has a laundry list of issues. The difference is that those issues are well known for the Confederates, is that it is in their favor that they had these issues and still perform despite them. But you have guys going into battle who don't know what they're doing at Antietam. They're not extremely well trained. One of the more pivotal moments of the fight happened when A.P. Hill's division came up from the south on the afternoon of the 17th. Well, the part of the Union Army that they're hitting, for those who might need a little background, this is a dramatic moment in the battle. Afternoon of September 17th, the final attack of the Union Army is sweeping up these fields towards Sharpsburg. It looks like they might actually break through the outnumbered Confederate right flank. And the last Confederate division to reach the field is reaching it at exactly the right time, exactly the right place. And, oh, by the way, they happened to hit a regiment that had never been in battle before, had only been in the Army a couple weeks, and they were in the middle of a giant cornfield on a hill. Because, a flat cornfield wouldn't have been difficult enough, a hill, too.
Yeah.
So, it's really interesting to look at these green recruits in the Union Army at Antietam and see some of the challenges they're facing.
Well, we've already picked on George B. Mack.
Yeah.
How about we pick on Lee a while?
Okay.
Is that good?
Sure.
Does he get himself caught up in a trap with that river behind him and all that stuff, the Potomac and all that?
So that's a really good question. And you could go a couple different ways in how you answer it. I would say ultimately, yes, Lee is fighting a battle with a river a couple miles to the rear of his position there. And it's a risky thing to do, but Lee is a risk-taking commander. I think he realizes that the longer the war goes with that sense of timing, it's imperative that he try to have a victory at some point over Union forces on Union soil, so he's willing to take those risks. The whole campaign is a risk. Right. So, yeah, it's definitely a risk. I don't think that – I would say that probably – on the morning of September 16th, Lee is still thinking there might still be a way for me to go north from here towards Hagerstown. It's not till Union forces start crossing over the upper bridge under the northern part of the field that he's pretty well stuck to fighting at Antietam. But even then, if you're going to fight with a river a couple miles behind your position, you're going to want terrain like what he had at Antietam. I mean, the ridges there, the terrain is just incredible. It's an incredible battlefield to study. It's an incredible battlefield to hike because the terrain is so well preserved. It's so distinct with the hills and the ridge lines. And the way Lee set up outside of town, he had perfect positions for artillery. He had internal lines where he was able to easily shift his men around the field throughout the day. So I would say, yeah, it's a big risk. I don't know if I'd use the word trap, though, but it's definitely a big risk.
Right. You talked about how the battlefield looks, and it's one of the most beautiful battlefields I've ever seen out there. And how has that changed over the years, and our perception of that battlefield has changed? 'Cause I know there was like a trailer that used to be like a double-wide trailer. It used to be right next to the Dunkard Church and other stuff. And it's just been like, wow, that's only been like 30 years ago, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It's changed dramatically in our lifetime.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about the transition of it becoming the shrine that it is today?
Well, I like that you used shrine because I think it is. I think Antietam is the best preserved battlefield. Shiloh is up there certainly as well, but Antietam is a remarkable piece of ground for the preservation efforts. It was one of that original five, the first five, Civil War battlefields preserved by the War Department in the 1890s. And it's been an evolving philosophy. Initially, they didn't purchase much ground at Antietam. It was a whole different approach than here at Gettysburg. There was no version of the GBMA like right after the battle. But it was maintained as farmland for so many years. But over the last 30, 40 years, in our lifetimes, the Park Service has acquired huge portions of what the battlefield currently entails. And they're still doing that. They're still acquiring important tracts of land all over the place. And it's not just that, but they're making it accessible with trails. They're doing just remarkable things there. They just did a huge rehabilitation of Burnside Bridge, and they're redoing the walkway down there. The bridge was literally falling apart, and the Park Service was able to restore it, and they do a tremendous job. The West Woods at Antietam, where my ancestor was killed 30 years ago, they were replanting all of that to be what it is now. So it's really remarkable.
What part of the battlefield would you say is the part where it has like the most mythology involved with it? Would you say it's like Burnside's Bridge, or like where we're like we go there and we're like, well, why couldn't you take this? Or because we have hindsight and we're like, oh yeah, this is pretty easy. Let's do this. And because I think about that at Burnside Bridge, it's like people always just like, oh, Burnside was an idiot. He couldn't get across this bridge. Are there any parts of the battlefield that you think are like that, where it has like the most mythology about the way we think about the battle?
I would say the bridge. I would say the bridge. It's a great example. First of all, who here has ever heard that the battle was fought in 3 phases, by a show of hands? Okay. Let the record reflect that a lot of hands went up.
Including mine. Yeah.
So the whole idea that the battle was fought in 3 phases. It's morning phase, cornfield, midday phase, sunken road, afternoon phase at Burnside Bridge. So the afternoon phase at Burnside Bridge, this is a pet peeve of mine. So the fighting starts at 10 a.m. You can't say it's the afternoon if it starts at 10 a.m. So one myth is that the bridge was the afternoon phase of the battle. It's what I would call the southern phase, because it's basically everything south of where the Boonesboro Turnpike is, modern-day Route 34. That's the southern phase. So for one, that it was fought in the afternoon. It really wasn't. Another myth with the bridge is that was the focal point of the southern part of the battle, where really that was just a means to a larger end of attacking towards the town and the final attack of the Union Army. And really, what you said there with our perceptions of Burnside and the bridge itself, and why did he need to cross it, that's another big myth, is folks look at it today and they see the slow, meandering Antietam Creek, and they think, what's the big deal? Yeah, like, I could get through here. Well, you might be able to wade through, but you're not a Civil War soldier. You're not commanding thousands of Civil War soldiers. You're not trying to have to go through there with Confederates up on the hill overlooking you, firing down at you. There were a couple hundred casualties in the fighting at the bridge. There were thousands more after that in the attack towards town. But the bridge was an essential crossing point. It had to be taken to attack on that end of the field. Lee himself knew that because of the 3 bridges on the battlefield. There's only one that he defended, and it was that one. So it was an essential crossing point for the Union Army. And it took them a couple hours to cross there because it was a difficult job. It was a difficult task. It's a narrow bridge, about 12 feet wide. You try sending the 12,000-man Ninth Corps across a 12-foot wide bridge, it's going to look like I-95 outside of D.C. at rush hour.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, since your ancestors in the West Woods, why don't you touch on West Woods, because
Yeah.
that's important to you.
Yeah, so the West Woods, it's not one of the most famous parts of the battlefield. It's the cornfield, the sunken road, the bridge are the most famous parts. But the West Woods was really integral to the story of the battle itself. After 3-4 hours of bloody fighting around the cornfield on the morning of the battle, you had about 8,000 casualties. But you also had Confederates driven back behind this woodlot with Union soldiers having an opportunity to really do some damage to the Confederate flank. And you have 65-year-old Major General Edwin Vose Sumner leading the division of John Sedgwick right into the West Woods, trying to kind of sweep Confederates from that part of the field. And he essentially is bringing them into exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. That happened multiple times for the Union Army at Antietam. They had some pretty bad luck. And they were also going up against Lee on one of his finest days of the war, I would say. But in the West Woods, you have this entire division, 5,000 plus, John Sedgwick's men, all veteran soldiers, all from the peninsula, my ancestor, one of them. And in about 30, 40 minutes, they take over 2,000 casualties. It's one of the more, I would say, untalked about, unspoken, just great slaughters of the war. It almost parallels the losses of Pickett's division in some ways. It's just devastating casualties in such a short time span in the West Woods there. And just the events that took place, you have Sumner, this corps commander, riding around trying to rally his troops together. He wrote a letter to his wife several days later saying that in the roar of battle, he was screaming so loud that he couldn't talk audibly afterwards. He lost his voice trying to rally his men. You had Oliver Wendell Holmes in the West Woods. He was wounded there, future Supreme Court Justice. Edward Revere. We know Paul Revere, who was, of course, from the Revolution. His grandson, Paul Revere, killed here at Gettysburg. Well, his brother, Edward Revere, was in the same massacre. There's some really powerful stories there, and of course that's where my ancestor was last seen. Essentially what happened was when this flanked attack came up, his regiment tried to turn and do a defense against it, and he was last seen fighting along a fence line. And because he shaved off his beard a couple days before the battle, burial parties didn't recognize his remains, so he was buried as an unknown soldier. So the West Woods is an incredibly powerful part of the battlefield, absolutely.
And like you say, it's a part of the battlefield that sometimes just goes untouched.
Mm-hmm.
No one, people drive by it. You know, they go to Dunker Church and they fly past it and go to the cornfield or whatever else. Do you think that makes it more of a solemn thing for you personally?
I do.
To know that when you go there, it's kind of quiet?
Yeah, when I go to battlefields, I love East Cavalry Field because it's so quiet.
Yeah.
I love the parts where you get a little bit out into the landscape more, and you don't necessarily have the tour buses coming by all the time. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I love the West Woods. That's the place to be. There's a great trail that cuts through there. The only problem is that there's a road that cuts right through there as well, Route 65, coming through the battlefield. But probably the coolest monument at Antietam is the 15th Massachusetts Monument, the Wounded Lion.
Oh, yeah.
It's in the West Woods itself. The 15th Mass took over 300 casualties, about 50% casualties, highest number of casualties for a regiment at the battle. It's a very poignant, powerful monument there.
And we know that elements of the Iron Brigade fought there. What became the Iron Brigade, they fought along the Hagerstown Pike right there near West Woods. So that's our connection with the ridge out here on the first day. And a lot of the troops that are there will go on to be here, except for those big 9-month regiments. They kind of phase out after Chancellorsville.
Yeah.
We know also that some of the fighting started the day before.
Yeah.
The skirmishing on the northern end of that was towards the East Woods, correct? That
Correct,
was some of the skirmishing?
Yeah, Union forces and Confederate forces kind of collided a little bit on the afternoon of the 16th of September. Not enough to really classify it as a 2-day battle, but there was some skirmishing, some casualties in the East Woods. And the most significant thing to me about that is because of that, because you have Union forces who've crossed over the creek and they've started skirmishing with some Confederates, because of that, both armies kind of went to bed on the 16th having a pretty clear idea of what was about to happen the next morning. You read letters from these guys. There's a letter from the soldier's name escapes me, but he essentially is saying, thousands of men will have no need for rations by tomorrow night. Confederate soldier in the West Woods area. Very, very close quarters on the night of the 16th for some of these men. Very close together. Just very, very powerful thinking about that evening. There's a rain that's falling. Both armies are going to bed knowing what's about to happen.
We touched on that real quickly when we were there for the CWI summer conference.
Yeah.
Because we're like, is this now a 2-day battle or not? And there was this little argument between all of us who were in the group together. We're like, is this going to be, for us, a 2-day battle or not? And it seems like, it's just the single day is again, this is going back to historical memory. The single day portion of it is what is significant to us.
Yeah, I would say it's still a single day battle. There's some skirmishing on the 16th, but nothing compared to like what was about to happen that next morning.
Right.
Yeah, certainly pales in comparison.
Right. What do you think after the fighting is done and the armies have moved on, what do you think the legacy is of that battle for those men at that time? Do they see that as one of the most gruesome engagements they've been in, one of the most brutal, in our words?
Yeah.
Or how do they perceive it afterwards? How do they perceive McClellan and Lee afterwards?
Well, you have a lot of soldiers who are writing, saying things to the effect of, at the end of the war, the fighting at Antietam was still the worst I saw. I think there's a quote from Rufus Dawes saying that the piles of dead along the Hagerstown Turnpike were far worse than anything he saw at Gettysburg or anything in '64 in the Overland Campaign. So it stayed with soldiers, I think, for the rest of the war, for the rest of their lives in many, many different ways. One name that always comes to mind for me is Colonel William Christian, who was a brigade commander in the Union First Corps. And on the morning of the 17th, he was supposed to lead his brigade into the cornfield, and he snapped. He fled his brigade. There was some chaos, some disruption. 2 days later, he resigned, and that followed him to his grave decades later. It stayed with him. So I think, Antietam was just that one day, but it stayed with folks. As far as how it impacted Lee and McClellan, I think really the 17th was one of Lee's finest days of the war. I think it stayed with him in that it told him how close he was. He was in Union territory. He had a chance at this battle. He had to try it again 9 months later.
Right.
For McClellan, I mean, that's the end of his combat career. Because he does not launch a full-throated pursuit quick enough for Lincoln's tastes, because McClellan wants to rest and rebuild this army that he had quickly rebuilt already. For him, that's the end of the line. But for McClellan, Antietam always stood out to him as the moment that in his mind he had done a great service. And I think he did there. I think he did.
Kind of as a wild card question.
Okay.
McClellan goes to Crimea in the 1850s, and he's over there, and he sees what that is like. He goes overseas as an observer. Do you think that ever plays a part in his leadership, where he's like, I've seen war over there, and that can be really brutal? And do you think that kind of plays? I've always wondered that about McClellan, because he's going over and seen European combat, and I've wondered if that kind of influences his leadership style.
First of all, that's a great question.
Thank you. I try once in a while to come up with a question.
I haven't really studied his writings from that era enough to answer that definitively from when he's over there in Crimea.
Right.
But I would say that McClellan I would answer it by saying this, that we often say that McClellan is a commander who's scared to see soldiers killed. I wouldn't use the word scared. I would use the word reluctant to see his soldiers killed. And the incredible thing to me is that we say that like it's a bad thing almost. Like that, well, this guy, he doesn't want to just, lose thousands and thousands and thousands of men. Well, okay, there's probably something to be said for that. But yeah, I think McClellan ultimately never wanted the Civil War to become what it did. He never wanted the war to become this bloody, almost revolutionary conflict that totally and fundamentally changed the United States. And the irony is that he's a moderate, really. He has a moderate approach. He wants things to go back to where they were. That's why he wants to take Richmond. Hey, we'll take their capital. It'll end the rebellion. Things will go back to normal. It'll be great. And the irony is that he's commanding at the battle that does more than any other to transform this into that bloody nation history-altering revolutionary struggle. So I would say, I can't say definitively, but I would think that stayed with him, what he saw, that influenced his view of warfare. Because you also have to think he's a very young man. He's only in his mid-30s at Antietam. I mean, for goodness sakes, he gets into West Point at the age of 15.
Right.
So he's a very young man when he's over there observing things in Europe. So.
Yeah, we think of McClellan as being this timid person, and then on the opposite end of the spectrum is Grant, who's the butcher, quote unquote, as they would say. Even though Lee's still losing more men than Grant is, and all that.
Correct.
So it's going back to how we perceive these two people and how we perceive their actions on the battlefield. It's so important.
Yeah.
What is your legacy with the battle itself, other than your ancestor? How do you perceive the legacy of the fight into even the 20th century?
Well, I would say, kind of what I mentioned earlier. Antietam was this epochal moment that changed things. For those who might not know the connection with the proclamation well, Lincoln decided to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in July, and he basically told his cabinet, "Hey, I'm going to do this, but I will accept your feedback as to how and when." So they advised, let's wait for a victory. It's kind of not a good time for us on the battlefield. A lot of people blame Lincoln for that letter he wrote August 22nd. Today's the anniversary of it, saying, if I thought freeing slaves would end the war, I would do it. If I thought not freeing it would end the war, save the Union, I would do it. Well, by that time, he had already decided to do it. So he's just politically posturing. But it really was hanging in the balance. Lincoln told Francis Carpenter later that when Lee crossed the Potomac into Maryland, he made a promise that at that point, if Lee was repulsed out of the state, that would be the victory for which he had been waiting. So for me, the legacy of the battle really is its connection to emancipation. It changed things in so many ways. It changed the lives of all the soldiers. It changed the commanders who were there. It changed the country itself in many ways. Photography brought the horrors of war home, but really its link to emancipation is for me the aspect of it. There's a quote that I love from a soldier. His name was Julius Ribardi. He was a soldier in the 12th Massachusetts Infantry, a unit that suffered 2/3 casualties in the cornfield. And Julius Ribardi was a French immigrant to the United States. He was born in 1833, and in the cornfield, he was on the eastern edge of it. He was hit in the leg, and his leg was broken. So he goes up to a tree in the East Woods, and he's crawling, using his elbows to crawl around this tree from side to side because he is caught between the two lines of fire. And if there's any worse place to be in the entirety of the Civil War, within the first hour of the battle at Antietam, in the cornfield, right there, that's an absolute horrible spot to be. And he's crawling around the tree. He survives. He lives to tell the tale. And several decades later, he wrote an account of his experience. And in the account, he said, "I was exposed to the fire of slavery and freedom," describing the two contending armies firing at him. He said it wasn't the fire of the North and the South. It wasn't the fire of blue and gray. It wasn't the fire of Union Confederates. It was the fire of slavery and freedom, which it quite literally was. So I think for me, that quote right there really captures the legacy of it. And just the human toll of it as well. The title of the book, That Field of Blood, comes from a Scottish-born chaplain who was with the 11th Ohio. Being from Ohio, I try to use Ohio quotes as much as I can.
I couldn't tell by your shirt.
No one who knows me would be surprised I'm wearing a Cleveland Indians shirt. But he said, in talking about the toll of the battle, that there will be countless homes where there's heartbreak far from that field of blood. That's kind of a paraphrase for part of it there, but the human suffering of it was what led to that history-altering proclamation that was really a defining event in many ways. So,
yeah. Before we wrap, let's talk about your book. How long did it take you to do this?
Well, it was probably about a year and a half or so for writing, putting it together. It was, first of all, it was a real great honor to be a part of the series. I don't know if folks are familiar with the Emerging Civil War series, but I'll give it a plug here. It's a great set of books that serve as introductions to major battles of the war, major stories of the war. A lot of really good people are involved in it, so it was awesome to be involved with this and do the book. And it was cool to be able to try to introduce Antietam to new audiences, to try to... It's a kind of a summation of the battle in a way. It's not an in-depth thing. If you've been hiking the trails there for 20 years, you're probably not going to find a ton of new stuff in it about the battle, but it was cool to get a chance to write this and talk about my ancestor, talk about the meaning of the battle. It was a really neat opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've worked with Chris Mikowski of the Emerging Civil War, and he's a great guy. And I do love the series of books because they are an introductory, like you said. And some of them give you spots on the battlefield to go to, and they're like, this is how you get there. And it really is helpful for people just getting in the entry level juices flowing, basically the curiosity flowing. I really like the Emerging Civil War stuff. So shout out to Chris Mikowski for getting us on board with that.
Yeah.
But again, that's that Field of Blood, the Battle of Antietam, September 17th, 1862, by my good buddy Dan Vermilya. And thank you for coming here tonight and being a part of this. And if you have any questions, I'm sure Dan will take them. If not, we're going to go to the bar for a little bit, I guess.
So do we get tattoos now? Is that how this works?
You had to throw a tattoo dad joke in there, didn't you? No, I'm kidding. We'll get a core badge on you. How about that?
I have two questions. One was, how did people get across the river, the Potomac? I assume it's the one that you're talking about. You'd say that was a problem, having the river to his back lead.
Mm-hmm.
And second, I'm interested in the townspeople and the slaves in Antietam, and what is. Do you know anything about their experience?
So first of all, with the river itself, there was a ford a couple miles to the rear of Lee's right flank, and that's where the fighting was for Shepherdstown. So there was a fordable spot on the Potomac. It's still there, depending on the height of the water. So there is a ford across the river that they could use. As far as the townspeople during the battle, Antietam did not have a civilian killed during the battle. There is no Antietam Jenny Wade. But the townspeople still suffered significantly. The Mumma farm on the battlefield was burned by Confederates. They didn't want it to be used as a safe haven for Federal forces. There was another barn, the Real Barn, was used as a field hospital and caught fire from artillery while there were wounded soldiers inside. So there was damage from the battle because typical stories of farmers applying for help from the government. The government saying, well, no, the Confederates did this, we're not giving you any money. But there were slaves living on the battlefield as well. Washington County, Maryland, did have some slave population. Maryland overall had about 87,000 slaves when the war started. Washington County was far fewer than the eastern and southern parts of the state, so it's not nearly as prevalent there, but it did exist. The bricks for the Dunker Church were made at one of the battlefield farms, and there were slaves at that farm. So there were some slaves out who lived on the battlefield itself. So it's Antietam impacted the civilians. It impacted everybody.
Any other questions? Yeah, we got a couple over here.
Dan, none of us have ever seen a Civil War battle, but based on what you know, do you think the opening scene in the movie Glory was the best Hollywood depiction of what it really looked like?
Well, I would say overall Glory is by far the best Civil War movie. And it might be a little sacrilegious to say that in Gettysburg, but
I agree.
Glory
with
is hands down the best Civil War movie, just terms of being a great film and being an amazing, powerful story. The opening scenes are not entirely accurate for what took place at Antietam, in terms of the actual troop positions, things like that. It showed Robert Gould Shaw's wound being a little bit worse than it actually was. So they took some dramatic licenses with it there. As far as it being really accurate for Civil War combat, I don't know. I guess I've never really thought of it in that exact term, but and it serves as a powerful opening for the movie, and it's certainly a powerful connection that you have Robert Gould Shaw, this officer who served at Antietam, who ended up leading the 54th Massachusetts and dying with the regiment less than a year later.
Right. I've often thought about that scene as in far as that scene at Antietam and the beginning scene of Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah.
It's like it's not absolutely historically accurate, but it's that thing that just grabs your attention to be like, wow, this is going to be intense, and this is a really intense moment.
Yeah.
We had another question over here. Yes, sir.
So I don't know much about Antietam, so I wanted to find out, is this a myth of the captured battle plans?
That's a great question. That was one of the things we were talking about maybe going over tonight.
Yeah.
So the question was the captured battle plans. And I'm really glad you asked this.
Yeah, because I forgot.
No. No. I didn't.
No, I did. Go ahead, please.
So, basically, Special Orders 191 is what you're referring to. On September 9th, when Lee and the Confederates were in Frederick, Maryland, there was a Union garrison at Harper's Ferry and at Martinsburg in Virginia. And Lee could not operate with Union forces at the opening to the Shenandoah Valley while he was in Maryland. So he issued Special Orders 191 to divide up his army and try to get rid of this Union garrison. It was marching orders for the Confederate Army on September 9th. On September 13th, 4 days later, it makes its way into Union hands. And essentially what it tells the Union Army is that the Confederate Army is divided. And that's about it. Because the orders were inaccurate by that point. Some of the troops had changed their marching routes. They say nothing of Confederate strength. McClellan had been told that there were over 120,000 Confederates. There were not that many. And also the orders basically said that this operation to capture Harper's Ferry, get rid of the garrison there, was supposed to have been wrapped up by the 12th. So they're 4 days old, they're out of date, the operation should have been wrapped up. And somehow this is described as the intelligence coup, the intelligence find of the war. And the phrase I hear a lot is the battle plans. It actually doesn't really have anything to do with Antietam. If you're talking about South Mountain, which was fought on the 14th, the battle right before Antietam, it leads to that fight. But as far as Antietam itself, the battle plans didn't really have any relevance whatsoever for that. The other thing to note is that it's not the first time, it's not the last time that an order falls its way into enemy hands during the Civil War. There were numerous times in August '62 that happened. So it's a good question.
I was wondering, is it the perception that McClellan had the plans, and therefore, geez, he couldn't even beat these guys?
That's the tale that is spun, that McClellan had, basically the Civil War equivalent of Navy SEAL Team 6 and the Confederate battle plans, and he still can't do it.
They got the ships going to Pearl Harbor and all that stuff.
But really, it had nothing to do with the battle itself, the Antietam itself. But you read some historians, and they say that and basically any other general could have used this to destroy the enemy. And well, no, that's not the case at all. There's a lot of debate over when he actually gets the orders. Some people allege that he got them on the morning of the 13th and then waited almost a full day. Well, he himself said he got them in the evening, and the very next morning he's launching an attack at South Mountain. So it's a much shorter timeline between when they received the orders, the news that the Confederates were divided, and the start of an operation against them. So it's not quite the intelligence find it was made out to be. So.
Yeah, I'm glad that question came up, because that is a very important question.
Yeah.
Any other questions before we wrap this part up? All right, thank you, Dan, for coming out. Let's give it up for Dan tonight. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Garryowen, for having us again. Next month is the 1-year anniversary party for the Tattoo Historian Presents. So we're going to have sea shanties here live next month because we need to have music. And we might even sing along. Do you want to come and sing along? Or
Maybe.
Maybe? Okay. Clear your throat. You're going to have to sing along. And it's going to be a great time. We have the guys from the punk band Depth Charge coming. So we're going to we're gonna have a nice party up here for next month for our 1-year anniversary, and we're gonna be scheduling out more as we go, and I'll let you know all about those. So thanks again for coming out, everybody.